give me a pleasure to introduce the next member of the Hall of Fame, Mr. George Cooke.
Just observed I've never done much for formalities, so I wanted to get right to the mic and try to get a few thoughts out. First of all, let me start by saying thank you. I can't help but make a passing comment about the red and black being worn by all members of the CCA. I hope that's an indication of Travis' continuing support for this sport of Blue and white are always fine, but I could adopt black and red if it means money for curling. I'm going to just take a moment here and tell a couple of stories, if I may. I think they have some sense of, they're true stories, but they have some sense of relevance to some of the things that are going on in curling these days. And I'll try to tie it together. When the awards were announced several months ago, it was sort of very obvious to anybody that followed this that Ron and I had no particular place in media coverage in Canada. The whole story went from coast to coast as Kevin Martin is going into the Hall of Fame. Now, I understand that very clearly, and Ron, whether you do or not, I'm not sure. Kevin has given me permission to tell this story as long as he was speaking after me. And so I read the news clippings. My retirement, I moved to board work on a bunch of clipping services, and I read countless clippings about how Kevin Martin was going into the Hall of Fame. And I was still enjoying the news on my part, but there was nothing there. And then I got a call from the local radio station in New Lister, Ontario. Now, for those of you that don't know, I was born in New Lister, raised in Halebury, I'm a northerner. And they asked me if I would actually call in from Toronto and do an online call-in show with their weekly sportscast. And I thought that was pretty cool. It wasn't TSN, but it was, you know, for a guy that hadn't been covered, it was pretty cool. And so when they started the interview, they introduced me. The chap that was on the other end, I think he'd been doing that job for about 35 years. I remember him as a kid. The listening audience of likely about 400 on a good day. And I thought it was really important to just say how humble I was that I was going in with Kevin Martin. And the response came back, this isn't about Kevin Martin. We don't like Kevin Martin. Kevin Martin only wants to have one team in the bar from Ontario. We don't like Kevin Martin. We want somebody from Northern Ontario, so this show's about you. I really didn't know quite what to do with that. I've done countless TV interviews in my life, and that one actually quite stumped me. I spent the next 15 minutes trying to explain to him why I was wrong rather than talking about many of the issues in curling that I thought I should be addressing. In the remarks that were made, there was certainly reference made to the Dominion Curling Club Championship. And it's something that I'm quite proud of. But it's also not something that really belongs to only one person. And I'm just going to pause for a moment to tell you a little bit about how the genesis of this occurred. One night with a bottle of red wine, three colleagues, Trevor Wall, Lee Armstrong, and Shelley Ray. If you knew them, you would see them all in those various pictures that were up. We got into a conversation about what needed to happen for curling. And a lot of the discussion focused on giving the club curler a reason to be in the club, a continued reason to be in the club, and an event that they could aspire to, particularly in the day of elite athletes. We formed an advisory committee, and I'm going to just quickly mention some names because these guys were all totally instrumental in making this happen. They'll be known to many of you. Jim Mann, Jim Wade, Susan McGinnis, John Shea, Bill Duck, Al Hanks, who was one of my colleagues at the Dominion. And we cut across all the gamut of curling with that mix of people. We had one of everything. It was like a small version of Noah's Ark. And we were determined we were going forward, and we'd already made the commitment to go. We had the opportunity to go to the meetings in Ottawa and present our case to the various associations. I was an old guy who spent a lot of time in my early part of my career in Canadian politics, and had attended many meetings in Ottawa. Lee was a young girl, recently hired by the Dominion, not necessarily very experienced in what it was like to be a curler, but not necessarily all that experienced in what it was like to deal with the politics of Ottawa. And as we were going into the presentation, she said to me, "What do you think is going to happen?" And I said, "Well, we're going to knock them dead with our presentation, and then this is what's going to happen. Somebody's going to speak first, I don't know who it'll be, and they're going to say this is a great idea. We're going to get questioned about whether or not Northern Ontario will be a province. We're going to get questioned about whether or not our materials will be published in both French and English, and then somebody's going to stand up and urinate all over the idea." She looked at me as if, "How do you know this is going to happen?" Anyway, we went through the whole thing, and as it turns out, someone stood up and right out of the blocks, "It's the best thing that's ever happened to curling in my lifetime. Is Northern Ontario going to be considered a separate entry?" I'm from New Haileybury and New Lisket, of course it is. Our town was 50% English, 50% French. Of course we're going to do the official languages, no issues. And then someone stood up from one of the provinces, we won't say which one, and said this was the dumbest idea and that it shouldn't happen. We were not deterred. In fact, I was actually kind of amused that I managed to guess that right. Lee said to me at the end of it, "How did you know that?" I said, "I've been to countless First Minister's meetings, I've been to countless Finance Minister meetings in my prior life. This is Canada, it's the way we work." And I tell this story, one because it's true and it was part of the genesis, but there's some things that you can draw from it. This seemed like it wouldn't have come about if we hadn't been totally committed to it. We're a sponsor. We were committed to it as a sponsor, but a sponsor who understood curling. We got tremendous support from the CCA, from Greg and Danny especially. A lot of it was quiet behind the scenes because it couldn't be out in the open. And we had all the challenges of trying to find something that could work with a variety of associations, each one of which has their own reason for being the way they are, and we're all full of good reasons for where they were, but it needed somebody to drive it in order to make it happen. 5 years later, I think it's a pretty healthy event. It's been successful because of countless numbers of volunteers and the enthusiasm of club curlers across the country. We combined an interesting component into it, in that although not all curlers that play in it would realize this, that some portion of every dollar of entry fee at every level, along with the volunteer committee fundraising activities around the national event, over the last 5 years have put almost $375,000 back into communities in which these events have been hosted. Or alternatively into wheelchair curling development, which in some jurisdictions the province has matched, or alternatively the spinal cord injury, which is a charity that is very, very dear to my heart. We stressed throughout the community and the community involvement in Canada, sportsmanship, which to me is absolutely key. Ron talked about that, I emphasize it. Perhaps the piece that gets a little bit lost in it is the real importance of the sponsorship. Dominion not only did junior curling development, we got fairly involved in wheelchair curling and in stick curling. We wanted to broaden the accessibility of the sport to those that otherwise might not have had an opportunity. We wanted to extend the careers of many others. Now, the career extension is actually critical to many local clubs. When you introduce the stick, you likely add somewhere between 5 to 7 years to the life of a curler whose knees otherwise may have given up. And whereas you can, in some settings, not understand the financial impact that has, in many others, it actually is the difference between a go or a no-go in terms of the continuation of the club. And the club is actually an integral part of the community across the country. The one thing that I never got to was the fact that, having done all those things, if you don't introduce new curlers into this sport, the sport won't continue the way we know it. And so we did have the emphasis on the junior development, but what we haven't done in this country is found a way to sort of reflect the ethnic diversity of our citizens in the sport of curling. Today, curling remains still largely a white person's sport. If you live in Toronto, where over 50% of the people are new Canadians from some other background, if we don't find a way to reach out and challenge those people and invite them into the sport that we know and love, so that they can know it and love it too, we won't be successful many years from now. And what's most interesting is, although I would support so strongly the development of the high-performance centers that people talk about, the next elite athlete, like Kevin Martin, is likely playing right now in some curling club somewhere in this country that otherwise is somewhat in financial difficulty. And so balance between what we do with our elite athletes, and my God, we've got tons of them, and what we do with others, because the foundation for this sport is very widespread. It needs to remain that way. If I could just make one last passing comment as I stop, and I know, Ron, I'm not adhered to your 3 Bs, so be it. I've never been one to follow the crowd. We have to realize that the nature of our events and the way in which we design them has to change. Hopefully we'll have an evolution that allows things to adapt as we go and supports the ever-evolving competitive landscape. If we don't, we'll find a revolution after we've sort of taken ourselves out of the spotlight of being the premier country in the world for curling. And so, whereas I don't have the perfect prescription at this moment in time, I suggest to you that all aspects of this sport, not just that at the local level that I've talked about, but at the competitive level as well, we need to be constantly setting aside the way things have been and looking at the way things need to be, so that we ensure that what we're doing is producing the greatest opportunities possible for our elite athletes to be able to continue to achieve on the stage. And I think one of the things that touches is the nature of the events themselves and the structure. It also has to address head on our willingness and receptiveness to introducing new roles for sponsors in the sport. Because quite frankly, without money, you don't have any way of funding the otherwise needed results. I'll conclude by saying this is a true honor. It was completely unexpected, and to the extent that I'm able to share it with my colleagues who are all an integral part of it, thank you very much.